Initiating with a flexible knight sortie, the focus shifts to central control and preparing for rapid piece development without committing to a pawn structure immediately. Embracing the fianchetto offers robust diagonal control for black's king. Unlocking the kingside with a fianchetto, preparing a long-term pawn structure for king's safety. Developing the bishop to this diagonal immediately pressures the center and prepares for castling, a solid response to white's flexible setup. Securing the long diagonal with this bishop solidifies the kingside fianchetto, anticipating further kingside expansion. Boldly staking central territory, black immediately challenges white's fianchetto setup, preparing for piece development and potential pawn breaks. Challenging the center, this advance immediately injects dynamism into the pawn structure, creating both attack and defense options on the queen side. Solidifying the center while opening the queen's diagonal, this pawn push prepares to meet white's flank pressure with central stability. Securing the king's safety is paramount before launching any central action, ensuring a robust defensive setup. Developing the knight to f6 solidifies black's central pawn structure and prepares for further queenside expansion. Preparing to fianchetto the queen's bishop, white subtly solidifies the queenside structure and aims to contest the central pawn tension with a flexible setup. This tranquil development discourages immediate pawn breaks from black and sets the stage for a potentially slow-burning positional struggle. Injecting a knight to e4 creates immediate central friction, challenging white's kingside fianchetto and potentially disrupting their planned queenside expansion. This proactive piece placement demands careful calculation regarding pawn structures and defensive capabilities, as it opens up lines for both offensive thrusts and defensive repositioning, while simultaneously offering a tempting target that could lead to tactical exchanges. Solidifying the center and preparing to challenge black's knight is the primary goal here, aiming to develop a more imposing pawn structure and potentially free up the queenside for future expansion. Solidifying the king's safety, this castling maneuver tucks the monarch away behind a pawn wall while simultaneously bringing the rook closer to the center, preparing for potential future skirmishes on the open d-file. Developing the bishop to this diagonal immediately aims to pressure black's queenside pawn structure, especially the c6 square, while simultaneously reinforcing the central control established by the pawns and other pieces. It's a subtle but effective way to build a cohesive setup, preparing for potential pawn breaks or simply improving piece harmony for the middle game. Developing the bishop to f5 immediately challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to disrupt their smooth coordination and perhaps prepare for a kingside attack later. Developing the knight to the edge of the board opens up possibilities for it to redeploy to a more active square, potentially e4 or f3, while also supporting a future e2-e4 pawn push, aiming to gain central space and dislodge black's knight currently occupying e4. Unleashing the queen towards the kingside opens up a dynamic struggle for central squares, forcing white to confront immediate pressure while potentially exposing their own monarch to long-range threats. Preserving the queenside structure against potential inroads like black's queen or knights, this move also prepares for future pawn advances or piece repositioning, subtly reinforcing white's territorial ambitions and setting the stage for a slow positional squeeze. Rerouting the knight towards the queenside offers improved mobility and potentially prepares a future c5 advance, challenging white's central pawn structure. Initiating a pawn storm on the queenside to disrupt black's coordination and gain a foothold for the rook. A surprising retreat for the queen, seemingly conceding the initiative and surrendering the central initiative that black had fought for. This repositioning suggests a desire to regroup and perhaps build a defensive fortress, but it opens up a critical diagonal for white's bishop, potentially targeting the kingside later. Instead of pressing for active counterplay, black appears to be prioritizing safety, a choice that could lead to passive play if white consolidates effectively. The queen's journey back to d8 might signal a fundamental reassessment of black's attacking potential on the queenside, opting for a more conservative setup. Consider if this queen placement offers any future attacking prospects, or if it simply becomes a passive spectator in the unfolding game. Harnessing the queenside pawn structure, this maneuver aims to disrupt Black's camp by creating imbalances and potential weaknesses down the b-file, subtly eyeing the pawn on c6 while preparing for a more aggressive pawn storm or piece infiltration. Reasserting central influence with the knight's repositioning, Black seeks to re-establish piece harmony after White's queenside expansion, potentially preparing for a future pawn push or exchange on d4 to unravel the queenside pawn structure. Anchoring the rook to the d-file, this maneuver prepares to challenge Black's central pawn and potentially open lines for an assault, while also reinforcing the d4 pawn and supporting any future advance of the e-pawn. Black boldly challenges White's central structure with this pawn thrust, aiming to pry open the queenside and create space for their pieces. Opening the queenside flank with this pawn thrust aims to disrupt Black's developing rhythm and potentially seize space, forcing a reaction. Black grasps the offered pawn, initiating a dynamic pawn exchange that disrupts White's queenside structure and opens lines for counterplay. Reclaiming the central outpost immediately addresses the pawn capture, repositioning the knight to a more active square where it eyes the queenside and supports potential breakthroughs, while simultaneously disrupting Black's queenside pawn structure and indirectly creating pressure on the d5 pawn. Black's decision to advance the a-pawn here aims to lock down the queenside, potentially trapping White's light-squared bishop or at least restricting its mobility, but it creates a structural weakness on b5 that might become a target later in the game. Disrupting Black's intended queenside expansion, this maneuver aims to exploit the potential weakness on the c4 square and force a decision regarding the advanced pawn. A daring dive into the enemy camp, this knight repositions to a remarkably active square, bypassing White's doubled pawns and eyeing the critical e3 and c4 squares, aiming to disrupt White's meticulously constructed pawn chain and potentially open lines for Black's pieces, a bold challenge to White's queenside expansion. White seeks to rearrange the queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the kingside or preparing a reevaluation of the queenside pressure, though the immediate forward push of pawns has created some static imbalances. Black seizes the initiative by liberating the pawn on c4, creating dynamic imbalances and forcing White's knight to a less advantageous square. This exchange opens diagonals and potentially prepares further pawn advances, fundamentally altering the pawn structure and demanding a reevaluation of White's defensive setup. Disrupting Black's central pawn chain by directly attacking the d5 pawn with the knight creates immediate complications and forces a decision about the compromised central structure. Asserting dominion over the central open files arises as the primary imperative following White's apparent pawn sacrifice, as Black's rook now occupies a crucial pathway. The knight embarks on a journey to the queenside, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the exposed queen. This aggressive rook infiltration directly targets White's queenside structure and threatens to unravel Black's entire position, if not met with immediate attention. Removing Black's active bishop from the board opens up the long diagonal for White's queenside pieces, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around the Black king and potentially build pressure on the c-file. A bold foray by the bishop, seizing central influence and creating immediate complications around White's queen and knight, forcing a difficult decision for the opponent. Reclaiming the open file is paramount. This rook retreat aims to contest the now liberated d-file and support potential central pawn advances, while also preparing to redeploy the rook to more active squares like d3 or c2. Suddenly, Black's queen becomes an ambitious intruder, swarming towards the queenside, aiming to disrupt White's carefully constructed pawn chain and potentially exploit the open files that might soon materialize. Sacrificing the exchange opens lines for White's pieces and aims to disrupt Black's coordination. The intention behind this rook sacrifice is to pry open the c-file for potential future use by White's rooks, while simultaneously removing Black's actively placed rook from its strong post. Observe how White's pieces are poised to exploit the ensuing disarray in Black's camp. The immediate consequence is a temporary material deficit for White, but this is often a calculated risk for positional advantage. Consider the long-term implications of this trade. Will white's active pieces compensate for the lost pawn and rook? The game now pivots towards a phase where tactical alertness and precise piece placement will be paramount for both sides to navigate the complications arising from this bold exchange. A necessary exchange that simplifies the position, forcing a shift in black's offensive strategy, as the initiative now rests more squarely on white's shoulders to prove compensation for the pawn deficit. The rook now claims the open file, a crucial step in preparing for the inevitable endgame where its power on the 7th rank will be paramount. Black's bishop now asserts a commanding presence on c2, creating a potent battery aimed at white's queenside and threatening to infiltrate the 7th rank. Asserting central presence with the pawn push, white aims to liberate the rook and destabilize black's knight, potentially opening lines for attack as the game transitions towards an endgame where even a slight material advantage could prove decisive. The knight's retreat to b6 skillfully reroutes the knight to a safer square, avoiding the direct threat of the e4 pawn and preparing to support a potential pawn push on c5. This maneuver also opens the possibility for the knight to influence the queenside more actively in the coming exchanges, potentially creating new attacking avenues or bolstering defensive structures. Reclaiming the initiative, this bishop retreat activates a dormant piece and prepares to contest control of the central files, hinting at a future pawn push or a strategic repositioning of the king's protector. An excellent opportunity arises to seize the open c-file and challenge white's central structure, potentially opening lines for your rook and creating pressure. Clearing the e-file creates an immediate threat against the doubled pawns and aims to disrupt black's defensive structure. Stabilizing the pawn chain and preparing to challenge the open files after the recent exchanges feels like a prudent step, allowing black to consolidate their structure and contemplate counterplay on the kingside or through the center. Reclaiming central influence, the knight repositions, aiming to contest the dark squares that have been a sanctuary for black's pieces and to prepare for potential pawn pushes that could liberate white's position. A desperate attempt to break free from white's suffocating central grip, this pawn thrust aims to open lines for black's beleaguered pieces, but it significantly weakens the kingside, leaving the monarch exposed to potential raids and creating structural vulnerabilities that white can exploit with precision. A bold repositioning, bishop moves to a square where it exerts pressure on black's central pawn structure, while simultaneously eyeing potential breakthroughs along the c-file, forcing a re-evaluation of defensive commitments. Initiating a pawn exchange on this square fundamentally reshapes the central pawn structure, opening a diagonal for the black queen and potentially activating the d-file. However, it also sacrifices the central pawn presence and creates weaknesses that white's pieces can exploit. The king now appears more exposed, and the immediate tactical implications of the removed knight and bishop will need careful consideration, potentially leading to a more open game where piece activity takes precedence over pawn structure. Clearing out the bishop leaves black's queenside structure somewhat weakened, but the potential for white's passed pawn on the c-file is now significantly reduced. The rook's repositioning aims to contest the open file, a vital attempt to establish counterplay against white's slightly more active pieces and the central pawn majority that's beginning to form. Shifting the bishop to the rim creates a curious pin along the b-file, not immediately threatening, but rather building a subtle pressure that black must respect, potentially forcing a concession or limiting his active options, all while the white king remains surprisingly secure in the center. Seeking to tie up white's pieces and prepare a central pawn push, black mobilizes the rook to the 3rd rank, aiming for a more active position. Seizing the initiative, white eliminates a dangerous defender, simplifying the position and opening lines. The capture on e5 forces a crucial decision for black, as their piece on c2 is now undefended. This exchange aims to exploit black's somewhat scattered minor pieces. White hopes to create dynamic play on the e-file and potentially target the weakened king's position, while also freeing up their own pieces for more active roles. The immediate consequence is a material imbalance that white intends to leverage through superior piece activity and control of open files. This move sets the stage for a more aggressive middle game where precise calculation and dynamic understanding will be paramount. The rook's aggressive foray behind enemy lines, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially snag a pawn, brings immediate complications to the board. Securing the active rook on the 7th rank presents a significant positional challenge. Its presence demands immediate attention and limits black's strategic options. Intensifying the central struggle, black repositions the rook to a more active file, aiming to disrupt white's queenside pawn majority and potentially create counterplay on the semi-open b-file, a bold gambit to stir up the stagnant position. A delicate repositioning of the rook, aiming to liberate its partner on the c-file and activate a potentially dormant force. Strategically rerouting the bishop to d3 aims to reposition this key piece for potential central influence or to support advances on the king side, simultaneously creating a safe haven away from the open b-file's threats. Opening up lines towards the black king is a significant positional objective after the material exchange on the queen side. Black's decision to push the passed pawn forward here opens up fascinating possibilities, potentially creating a decisive threat down the queen side and forcing white to commit significant resources to its containment.